Hi everyone, I'm Brett Ullman, and welcome to Dating for Life, The Questions. I want to begin this talk in a very different way. I want to begin with a quote from a mainstream blog. I think this is a perfect thought of how your generation today is dating. Listen to this. It says this: we don't commit now, we just don't see the point. They've always said there are so many fish in the sea, but never before has that sea of fish been right at our fingertips on OkCupid, Tinder, take your pick. We can order up a human being in the same way we can order up pad thai on Seamless. We think intimacy lies in a perfectly executed string of emoji. We think effort is a good morning text. We say romance is dead, because maybe it is, but maybe we just need to reinvent it. Maybe romance in our modern age is putting the phone down long enough to look into each other's eyes at dinner. Maybe romance is still there, we just don't know what it looks like now. When we choose, if we commit, we're still one eye wandering. I love that. One eye wandering at the options. We want the beautiful cut of filet mignon, but we're too busy eyeing the mediocre buffet. Because choice. Because choice. Our choices are killing us. We think choice means something. We think opportunity is good. We think the more chances we have, the better. But it makes everything watered down. Never mind actually feeling satisfied. We don't even understand what satisfaction looks like, sounds like, feels like. We're 1 foot out the door because outside the door is more. We don't see who's right in front of our eyes asking to be loved because no one is asking to be loved. We long for something that we still want to believe exists, yet we're looking for the next thrill, the next jolt of excitement, the next instant gratification. We realize that this more we want is a lie. We want phone calls. We want to see a face we love absent of the blue dim of a phone screen. We want slowness. We want simplicity. We want a life that does not need the validation of likes, favorites, comments, upvotes. We may not yet know that we want this, but we do. We want connection, true connection. We want a love that builds, not a love that gets discarded for the next hit. We want to come home to people. We want to lay down our heads at the end of our lives and know we lived well. This is what we want, even if we don't know it yet. Yet, this is not how we date now, and this is not how we love now. The dictionary defines the word profound as having or showing great knowledge or insight, and this blog, in my mind, is profound for your generation and on how you date. Let's do some quick ground rules before we actually get into this talk. First off, opinions. Have one. I would always say, I would rather you have a different opinion than me than to have no opinion at all. So have opinions and challenge other opinions. If there's anything I say in this talk, send me a message, find me online, and we can begin banter and discourse. That's what makes us better as leaders and speakers and teachers and just people as we walk through conversations together. Number 2, learn how to learn. I think we're wonderful listeners as Christians. I think we're horrible learners. If I was to say to you, what were the last 10 sermons you heard and how did it change your life, your faith, your practice, your relationship, how you date, or anything else? Many people couldn't even tell me the theme going on in the sermons, yet alone what's actually in them. So you need to find a system for learning, a way to learn. Whether it's having a laptop out, a phone, take those things out even during this talk you're listening to right now. Take some notes and then learn how to process afterwards. I use my iPad in church. I'm always the person with the largest computer and I take notes. And after I'm done, I actually email myself the notes. Why? Because on Monday morning when I check my email, those notes are there and I can process them afterwards. And lastly, pictures. You're welcome to take, if you're listening to this in a church service or in a youth group night, you're welcome to take out your phones and take pictures of any slides that you like. Now, just some kind of basic thoughts. First off, why do we have these defined rules in dating? I do think that they're more from tradition and not really from biblical principles. Why can a guy ask a girl out, but a girl has to sit and wait for a guy to ask her out? If we look at the Bible, it's a mix of arranged marriages and people choosing spouses. People often say to me, Brett, we should get back to biblical dating. And I say, really? You want me to give you my daughter as property and you give me, 80 cows or so many sheep? Not going to happen. Number two, we often talk when we speak on dating about boys. We talk about I love the kind of idea boys adrift. It's a title that comes from a book by Leonard Sachs. But we do have delayed adolescence, meaning that, those moments in life when we, got married, moved out, are getting longer and longer and longer. It used to be late teens, then it was 20s. Now we're into our early 30s. And it is both women and men, but I think we're seeing incredible delayed adolescence with men. And if you listen to lots of conversations, many preachers will tell men to grow up and stop playing video games, get a job, and marry up. And I don't disagree with that. I think those things are important. And women, dating is not a passive thing. I love in the Bible where it's like seek and ask and knock. They're all verbs. But we got to put away our lists of the perfect guy and stop waiting. Now, it does take action, but it's also harder for you as a woman from a numbers game. If the church is roughly 60 to 70% women, which is the stats I see these days, you're already at a disadvantage and looking for people who you might even be compatible with. I do have an earlier talk called Dating for Life. If you go on YouTube and find my channel or just search Dating for Life and Brad Ullman, the whole talk is there and you can walk through it. This talk is the new one called The Questions. It's almost all new content and almost all the resources come from YouTube. And every video that I use, every blog that's used in this talk, I have them all listed on my website. And at the end of the talk, I'll tell you that. It's just my name if you're wondering. New format though, we're just doing 8 questions today. And I'm really going back to the basics. Os Guinness, one of my favorite authors, says a very simple line. He says this: I live before an audience of one. So here's the tension. How do we look for the one and not have them replace the one God in our lives? Now, first, I don't agree with the term the one, and we'll address that later. But how do we not have someone we date replace God in our life? How do we do this? It's going to be by heading into dating relationships with preparation and intentionality. And it's also with the basic foundation that no person you date should ever take the place of God in your life. I do think we often remove God from his place in our life and end up replacing God with our boyfriend or girlfriend in those seasons. It must be God and you. In dating, I actually say it would be God, them, who you're dating, and in time your spouse, and then you. Let's do a quick history of dating. There's a great online article which I'll link for you called The Gospel and Sex by Tim Keller. And Tim says that before World War I, we actually called dating courting or calling on. It basically meant that I would go up to a woman and say, may I call on you? It sounds very weird, but if she said yes, I would then go to her house that night and I would sit around with her family, brothers and sisters or whoever else. And I always kind of laugh and think I'd be interrogated for the night, but that's probably kind of what happened. Around World War I, it switched to going out, and there were 3 foundational shifts which changed the way we date forever after this. The first is it shifted in power from the woman to the man. No longer was it dating in the woman's house with family and friends around, now it's actually going out somewhere. It shifted in focus from the family in that environment to the couple. And lastly, it shifted from assessing character to having a good time, which I think is probably the most important thing we're doing. We're supposed to be assessing character. Of course, we can also have a good time. There's a move I often hear in our Christian kind of subculture, which talks about going back to this courting or biblical dating. Tim talks about this in this article, and he kind of asks, why are we idolizing a certain time in social human history and not others? It's a really good point, and you can read the article. In all my talks, what I try to do is to narrow everything down to one slide. And if you look at this, it's a very simple flowchart. You begin to date someone, and then there's a very simple question. Is this the right person? Now, we're not talking about like the person for right now. We should be looking for the right person. And then there's only 2 choices. If it's no, we break up and then you date again. And this is the dysfunctional way we date, right? You date someone, not the right person, break up, and it's a cyclical, ongoing breakup. But if they are the right person, then we kind of say we have one option. We actually get married. Now, there are 2 kind of sub-conversations for this. The first would be the idea of not dating at all. People who are just waiting for someone to kind of show up that God sent them. I once had someone say to me, well, I'm not dating. And I said, oh, how come? And they said, well, I'm waiting for, God to send me someone. And I said, do you really think you will be sitting at home one day and there'll be a knock at your door and, you'll get it and they'll go, hey, I'm so-and-so, God sent me. It just doesn't happen. It's a very weird over-spiritualization of dating. But I also think not dating at all is a problem, and we'll talk about that later, where we just don't actually date. And the other side of this coin is also the conversation of divorce. With so many people getting divorced, are we choosing the wrong people? Do we have wrong expectations? The reality is this: we're not getting better at this. And I would say for anyone watching, your generation is not getting better at this. You need to be open to the possibility that you might be just downright awful at dating. What do I see today in dating? I think we overdo some things, and I think we underdo some things. I think we overcomplicate. Someone goes on a first date and we analyze and critique it to death. We've all watched shows like The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. You know what a first date is? It's nothing. You go out and you might be asking, what is your last name and what kind of coffee do you like and what's your favorite color and where do you work? It's basic stuff. We overthink. We think of, again, because of these shows, we critique things. We think and overthink. We over-spiritualize. I once went on a date and it was my third date with a girl and she told me that God told her that I was the one. We split up that night. It's just a little too much for me. We over-romanticize. You look today, everything has to be these promposals and these great ways we get engaged. And in that, we over-romanticize. We over-sexualize for sure. I read an article a few weeks ago that said the average college, university-age student will sleep together on between the first and third date. Now, we do life different as Christians, don't we? Which also should mean that we date different. And I also see that we're sometimes overly passive in dating. There was an article in Relevant magazine called Low Expectations, interesting article title, and they said this: don't settle for mediocrity. Pursue something meaningful, embrace the risks of romance. What I also see in dating is that we underdo some things. We underread. Please read books on dating. And I would say this, especially in our Christian world, a lot of books on dating are just pop culture. But you know what? Read them. They're a bit of pop culture, pop psychology, but underline those really special things, those nuggets of gold that you can use in your life. We underprepare, and this is more preparing ourselves, and we'll talk about this later. We underutilize community. Meaning what? We have friends and family around us that matter, and then we begin dating someone, and then we don't listen to what they say. And then we just underdate. It's okay to go for coffee with someone. It doesn't mean you're getting married. So here's the outline for this talk. I want to answer 8 questions. 1, what is dating? Very basically, what is dating? Number 2, when should I start dating? Number 3, am I ready to start dating? Number 4, how do I start dating? Number 5, what are red flags in my dating relationships? And some of you don't understand red flags. We'll explain that. Number 6, how do I find out if they're the one? Number 7, how do I break up? Which is one of the least talked about things I've ever heard in our Christian world on dating. And number 8, what if they are the right person for me? So let's begin. What is dating? Dating is dating, right? It's not dating. It's not just being at home. It's dating. It's not also asking out everyone around you to date. It has to be some kind of balance with that. Now, we can use any definitions you want, and we have a lot of weird ones in our Christian world. Biblical courtship, Christian dating, dating redeemed, biblical dating. I've kind of given you some different definitions, and let me walk through these with you. I believe there's a difference between what I might call small d dating and big D dating. Small d dating, I also just call hanging out. Now, in these, there are certain things. So in small d dating, there's initial investigation. Now, if someone's changing, whether it's Facebook and students, I know you don't have Facebook, but whether it's Facebook or someone on Instagram is posting that they have a boyfriend, or on Snapchat or whatever else you're using, if someone's changing a status on social media after a first date, they might actually be more interested in the idea of dating as opposed to actually dating you. Community involvement is just the idea that you should be asking your best friends and even your family, what do they think about the person you're dating? It's about, I always love the idea, it's around a coffee or a meal, the idea where it's great to sit and have a meal and just drink coffee and talk to one another. There's no commitment here. There's no commitment. You might not even be going out as just one person with one person. A lot of this is just done in groups. You could be in the same small group as church, the same youth group or young adults group, but it doesn't have to be just one-on-one. There's no physical involvement. And this is, again, where I think we have to date different as Christians. And there's basic questions of compatibility. Again, you might not know the person. I met my wife at a coffee house, and I had to get to know her on our first date. I didn't know where she grew up. I didn't know anything about her family. Some of you will date someone who you've known your whole life, so it might be a little different. Then at some point, we switch over to what I might call big D dating. Now, this to me is an actual relationship, which is why the first thing I say here is relationship building. And then there's community involvement, the same as the first. There's still a coffee or a meal. There is now some commitment, meaning you shouldn't be looking for someone else. If you want to, you should be breaking up and then going to look for someone else. But there's some commitment, there's some physical involvement, but not much, and there's complex questions of compatibility. We're going to walk through, I think, 150 or 170 later in the talk. After you go through these things, again, community involvement are the same in both, and coffee and a meal are the same in both. In the next slide, you'll see engagement is a word you can barely see because engagements should be small. I don't understand this idea of 3-year engagements. I'm talking to someone about 2 months ago, and they said they were getting married 2.5 years from now. And I'm like, why? You're in your mid-20s, you both graduated, you both have jobs. Why are you waiting 2.5 years to get married? We seem to meet the people we want and then wait until getting married, which I don't understand. Once you've chosen the right person and everyone around you thinks they're the right person and you've gone through all the kinds of things we're talking about today, get married. This one, when should I start dating, is an interesting one. There's really only 3 options. Junior high, kind of grade 7 and 8, maybe grade 6, 7, and 8, high school, and then young adult. Whoever you are listening, can we just agree that dating in grade 4 is the dumbest thing ever and just move forward? Anybody want to guess how many marriages arrive from a dating relationship in grade 4? It's 0. Now, statistically, it's 0 in grade 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Now, for some of the adults who are watching this, you'll write me and say, but Brett, I met my spouse, when I was in grade 9. And I'd say, yes, I'm 46. Now, I met my wife when I was 26, but there are people my age who met a lot younger. Today, we don't see that. The statistic I read is that the chance of meeting your spouse in grade 12 is around 10. The average age you'll meet your spouse is 21 to 25, and that was in Canada. And I think people are even meeting a lot later than that. So when should you start dating? You should start dating when you are at an age and stage in your life where the relationship, now listen to this, could have the chance of moving towards marriage. I did not say will have, I didn't say must have. But if there is no chance of a future for you as a couple, it's not dating. It's actually called mutual timed relationship destruction. In my earlier talk, I had a road, and that was kind of heading off to your future. But if there's no future for you, it's really a road with a tornado on the end. And people always laugh at it, but I'm like, that's the reality. If you know you're going to break up 9 months ahead, that's just timed relationship destruction. You will use each other for a time, and then it will be over. If you're dating someone for no future reason, you will break each other sometime when you break up. You will give your heart, and today we often give our body and our mind and our soul, use any terms you want, to someone who will end up breaking our heart. And if you think having your heart broken is not a big deal, you have never been close to people when they break up. It hurts. Again, we as Christians do life different, which also means that we need to date differently. I think you should start dating when dating can actually mean something, because if it doesn't mean anything, it's actually just a game. Matt Chandler had a blog, it was a YouTube video, on how do you know when you're ready to date? And he gives a bunch of points. Some of them are, number 1, you should have a sound relationship with God. I like that. Number 2, he says, are you part of a Christian community that can speak into your relationship? Let me be honest, for some of you, I keep saying this idea of community involvement, and that sounds really weird. It's the one thing I do really agree with the idea of arranged marriages. It's the idea of involvement from other people. I am not saying we do arranged marriages. I know any parent who listens with a kid, we always joke about that with other parents, but I'm not saying we do that, but I'm saying have relationship with people and have those people speak back into your life. If you don't want community involvement, I don't think you're ready to date. We talk about community, we read about community, we sing about community in church, and then suddenly when you start dating, we ignore that same community. Number 3, dating with a biblical end in view, which is marriage. And again, that's not right away. Please don't go on your 3rd date and you're thinking about marriage. We have to kind of have a balance with that. And lastly, no one is ready. None of us are perfect. We all have baggage. Do you confront your baggage or do you run? We're all sinners. Are we repentant and seeking God? Katie Gregoire wrote a really great video blog vlog, if you want to call it, called Why Am I Not Dating in High School? She says stereotypes of high school relationships and why I'm not going to participate in that. Number one, it's sort of silly, the I love him after 2 weeks. The on and off and on and off kind of relationships. It must just be horrible for people going through these types of relationships. Number two, the temptations you open yourself up to in relationships. And of course, we're talking about sexual conversations. Number three, the opportunities you miss out on due to having a boyfriend or girlfriend. Number four, all the drama, and I don't need to go into that, we know that. And number five is just the heartbreak, eliminating the chance of this happening at this time in your life. Now, as a parent, my wife and I made a very different decision in our house. We just said to my kids, you are not allowed to date until 16. Now, my daughter turned 16 recently, and so we've kind of been joking about that. But the reality is, I actually probably would change it now and say you shouldn't date until grade 12. Before then, hang out with people. Like, my kids know you're allowed to have guys and girls over. Like, my kids can have a party, like have a dozen people in the house, and it can be guys and girls. We're not saying it can't be that way, but we're just saying we don't want you to date. And the heartbreak, to me, is one of the biggest ones. So here's an interesting question. Am I ready to start dating? Now, the best answer for this by far comes from one of my favorite pastors, Andy Stanley. And Andy says this, am I ready to start dating? Now you have to listen to this, are you the type of person you're looking for is looking for? I say it again, are you the type of person you're looking for is looking for? Meaning, when you're looking for someone, are they looking back at you and seeing those amazing things that will make them actually want to be with you? If not, chances are that if you meet them, they would not be attracted to you. Now, if you're not that person, become that person. And if you are that person, again, we're not perfect, right? We're always a work in progress. I love words like trying, striving, yearning, working, building, pruning, growing, moving towards being that person. But if you're not that person, become it. If you are, start dating. In the online article, 7 Biblical Practices for Dating, the Am I Ready to Start Dating? They say this, far too often, the first step a Christian takes in thinking about how to date God's way is to sit down and make a list of all the qualities their future spouse needs to have. Then and only then, date people who fit the list. While the forethought is admirable, our first step in trying to date in a way that honors God is to be someone worth dating. I love that. Be someone worth dating. Our faith in Jesus should be active and meaningful, as Paul describes in Colossians. We are to be rooted and built up in Jesus. Lists are fine, but we should make a list for who we need to be first. Colossians 2 says, therefore, as you've received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him and established in the faith. So are you? Are you walking in him? What does that even mean? Are you a true disciple of Christ, or are you what I might just call a non-practicing Christian? You go to church for a few hours a week, but the rest of your life is really nothing like what you say or claim you are. If you are not walking in him, you're probably not ready to date. I read a quote researching for this talk, and I really love it. Here's what it says. Run as fast as you can towards God, and if someone keeps up, introduce yourself. You're not ready to date if someone still does your laundry. Now, I'm probably talking more to men than women, but even for a lot of women. Guys, I just say this, if your mom still does your laundry and you want to begin dating, you might be looking for another mom, not a wife, and that's creepy on every level in the world. But my point is this, if you're maturing and getting to a place where you think you should date, there should be maturing in other aspects of your life as one. Laundry's just one. We could talk about dishes and all these other things. Number 2, are you comfortable being alone? Do you need to be with someone? Because that's a problem. If so, you should be comfortable on your own first and be able to be on your own. And only when you're comfortable being on your own should you then actually start dating. Remember, if you are broken going into a relationship, you will be broken in that relationship. Relationships do not complete us. And the third one here, I just say deal with addictions. Now, this is not easy, but if you're struggling with a pornography addiction or a gambling addiction or an alcohol or drug addiction, deal with those things. And that sounds really simple, just saying deal with it. I'm talking about you might need counseling and you might need to put all kinds of things in place. And I have a talk on pornography, and you can Google Alcoholics Anonymous and things for alcohol and other drugs, but you need to begin to deal with your addictions. I would also say this, if you want to be single, stay single. But if you want to be involved in a relationship, then you have to kind of let go the ideas of being a single person, which means the world doesn't revolve around you anymore. You can't just do whatever you want. You can't just play dozens of hours of video games. You can't just spend your entire Saturday online. You can't do sports every night of the week. You're going to have to actually carve out time, like after school or work. The next thing should actually be the person you're dating. Submission, right? It's the idea of not asserting ourselves in order to come under the authority, the wisdom and power of Jesus. And what does that mean? Again, God, them, you. And media, I'm going to leave that one for now. We'll come back to it later. But I think if your media is highly sexualized, you're probably not ready to date as well. There is some spiritual conversations here. How about pray? Pray for opportunities. Pray for connections. Pray that God will bring people into your life. Pray for situations to meet people. Pray for guidance with your life, etc. Now, this might be less who you will be marrying and more who you are becoming as a true disciple of Christ. In the scriptures, you find very little help for the hunting part of dating. You do find lots of who you should become worth pursuing, though, because God did create us for relationship, not only with Him, but for others as well. Seek God's will. Don't over-spiritualize this conversation. I always say, if anyone says, God told me and it has to do with money or dating, I actually challenge that a lot. But also don't under-spiritualize, right? With so many of these things, we have to find a balance. Spiritual disciplines, this is how you grow in your faith. We sometimes call this spiritual practices. Reading, praying, fasting, studying, volunteering, all these other things. If you like these kinds of concepts, which you should as a Christian, read some books by people like Dallas Willard and Richard Foster. How about volunteering? I think it's great to be volunteering somewhere in the community or in a local church. For me, I coach rep baseball, and I love that. You should be dealing with your debt. You should be looking at the future, pursuing education or specific training in whatever field that you want to work in. There's a wonderful quote here from a blog, and I'm going to read this whole one. I think it's quite good. She says, my husband is not my soulmate. But then my theologian, biblical scholar father shattered my dreams by informing me that God doesn't have a husband for me, doesn't have a plan for who I marry. Not true, I scolded him, attacking him with the full force of Jeremiah 29:11, that God knows the plans He has for me, plans to prosper me and not to harm me, plans to give me a hope and a future. And obviously that means a hot Christian husband, because God delights in giving me the desires of my heart. He slammed through my horrible yet popular biblical abuse by reminding me that the first verse applied to the people of Israel in regards to a specific time, and just didn't even dignify my horrible abuse of the second verse with a rebuttal. Nope, he said, a husband is not only a biblical promise, it is also not a specific element of God's plan for my life. God's plan for us is to be made more holy, more like Christ, not marry a certain person. This advice was also used when I asked what college God wanted me to go to, accompanied, I think, by, God doesn't want you to be an idiot, so go somewhere you will learn. Probably my favorite quote in this talk. And then he gave me some of the best spiritual or some of the best relationship advice I'd ever got. There's no biblical basis to indicate that God has one soulmate for you to find and marry. You could have a great marriage with any number of compatible people. There is no one person for you, but once you marry someone, that person becomes your one at that point. You're ready to start dating when you can unromanticize dating. Soulmates, the one. Any one of you could move today and finish university in Germany, California, New York, Vancouver, St. John's, Newfoundland, anywhere in the world. And guess what? You're going to meet someone and get married. You could go to school somewhere. You could join the military. We will most likely all get married. I think the stats are around 97% of us. So the reality is this. Am I saying God's not involved? No, but I'm also saying that the reality is this idea of the one is probably not a biblical construct. Also, I love the quote that says, but a soulmate isn't a pre-existing condition. It's an earned title. They're actually made over time. And that quote's from Pamela Druckerman. So this isn't really a question, but it's something I need to address in the middle of this talk. It's on the idea of singleness. And I say this to anyone single in the audience. I just say, I'm sorry. I'm not sorry you're single. I'm sorry for the way that we as the church too often make an idol out of family ministry and marriage at the expense of you. And it's not okay. Now, in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 8, it does say this kind of conversation. We question, like, should I be single? It says, I wish that all men were as I am, but each man is his own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now to the unmarried and widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as am I. So here's what I hear sometimes from young adults. They ask me, well, maybe I'm supposed to be single. I'm 25, I'm 30, I haven't met someone yet. So how do you know if it's you? I think it's a pretty simple one. If you desire to be with someone and to be married, it's probably not you. It's that simple. I think too often we take life situations and then think, well, that might mean that God is saying something. John Stott actually addresses that in this quote. The question in this book, Singles at the Crossroads, says, do you think a person can know at an early age that he or she is called to singleness, or this is something you just fall into? He responds, I have no doubt that there are some people who believe God has called them to be celibate and to commit themselves to celibacy for the rest of their lives. Personally, I have a real hesitation about the wisdom of that because I'm not convinced that people know, say in their 20s, that God has called them to that. If they take a vow of celibacy, I think they may find themselves in grave difficulties later when they may fall deeply in love with someone and begin to change their mind about their guidance. Then they're in trouble about any vow they might have taken. I'm not in favor of vows of celibacy. He goes on to say this, I personally believe more in the second alternative you've given, which is this, that people discover it gradually, and as the years pass, begin to think that God is probably not calling them to marry. They don't meet a person with whom they believe God is calling them to share their life, or they don't fall deeply in love, or their work develops in such a way that it seems right for them to remain single in order to give themselves to their work rather than to a family. And as circumstances build up this way, they begin to discern, and I like that, they begin to discern that God is calling them to be single, and it's more the situation with me, is what John said. This is many years ago in 1975. Now, some say that it's a spiritual gift to be single, and I would say, do I have a spiritual gift of being married? If you're single, you have a gift. For the moment, it might change, and at this point on this day, it's never actually a curse. David Platt, in another YouTube video, says that God has a design in marriage and he has a design in singleness. And it's not that we're missing out of his design when we are one or the other. If we're married, we shouldn't, read 1 Corinthians 7 and think, well, I could be more effective for the Lord and his kingdom if I didn't have a family, a spouse and kids. And the design is not for us to read 1 Corinthians 7 or any other parts of Scripture and say, well, if I were married, then I could have a better testimony for the gospel. God has different designs in both. They are both for his glory. Singleness then has a purpose we must not be careful to waste. In marriage, don't squander your marriage, and in singleness, don't squander your singleness. He goes on to say that there are 4 foundations for biblical singleness. Number 1, both singleness and marriage are good. I agree. Number 2, marriage is expected, but singleness, number 3, is exceptional. And both singleness and marriage portray the gospel. One is not better or worse than the other. Back to our questions. So how do I start dating? You've realized that you're ready to start dating. You're at an age and stage to start dating. You think that you're someone who's kind of worth pursuing by someone else. So how do you start dating? This is the most simple answer. You go on a date. That's it. You go on a date. Now, what does that mean? Now, first off, as Christians, it's a little harder for us because we're living in a very smaller and isolated community in our greater culture today. My wife and I met at a coffee house that doesn't even exist anymore. It was a place where you'd go and hear a band play and have coffee or whatever else, but those places don't even really exist anymore. And the church today is not really set up for meeting people. Seats are in rows. You don't really get a chance to even talk to the people beside you, and it's facing a stage. So we as a culture are kind of more and more isolated. But if you're going to ask someone out on a date, you're going to have to be in an environment where you can meet and talk to people so that you can find someone to ask out. Meaning, go to church, volunteer is another great place, volunteering anywhere to meet someone else. There's events, go to concerts and birthday parties and barbecues. And I would say this, even things like online dating. Speed dating and some of the other websites, I'm not saying Tinder and some of these like swipe left or right. I'm not saying that, but it's hard to meet people today. So if I was dating today, I would use any of the ways that you can date. Number 2 here would be this. You're going to have to actually ask someone out for a coffee, which means you should have the basic communication skills, being able to read body language, etc., to know their answer before you ask it. Meaning if someone actually says no, there's probably a problem there. And it's also not just asking random people out. Now, this is a problem for both men and women, but we're finding today it's especially for men. Men, this is becoming an issue for many of us that we spend so much time playing video games with a headset on that we're becoming out of sync with real-world relationships. Many college-age girls today say that most guys don't even know how to have basic conversations with them. They can't look them in the eye. They can't, like they're looking around. They're just awkward in conversations. This is where we, both as men and women, also must be careful about our actions, talking about body language. People flirt with each other and then they have no desire to actually date. Meaning if someone asks you out because you were giving signs you were interested and you weren't, we have to be careful about that. This is actually hurting people. For some of you, it's just building a friendship and then one day one of you asks, "Are we dating?" To me, this is the purest form of dating, where it's just natural. You're friends, you're hanging out, your friendship grows, and one day you're actually dating. Another one is open and discussed boundaries, meaning not on your first date, but once you become like the big D dating I talked about, you actually should set some boundaries. Things like sex, things like time, how much time will you spend together, all those things should be open and discussed. If you can't openly talk about these things, you both shouldn't be in a relationship. And lastly, open up community involvement. Meaning, ask your friends around you, what do you think of that person? Your family, your inner circle, people around you. There's a great quote that said this: "I've never met a happy couple whose story included everybody, including our parents, told us we had no business being together, but we ignored their advice, and we're glad we did." This is a great article from Relevant Magazine. Very simple. How to go on an actual date. It says, just because a man and a woman are together doesn't mean it's a date or their intentions are romantic. In fact, it's vital to this theology of relationships that it's not to be seen that way. Therefore, a date needs to be a clear, intentional act of pursuing a relationship. The article goes on to give us a bunch of like a date is and a bunch of these different explanations, which are really good. Number 1, a date is inspired. Art is original, not copied or recycled. Going through the motions is cheap and disrespectful. And I kind of like that, plan some kind of different dates. Number 2, it's asked by name. Be open to getting to know someone as friends outside of a proper date, but reject the sneak a date. It's kind of the idea, I call it the lowest form of pursuit. You invite 10 people to a movie, or you tell, like if I'm going to ask a girl out, I invite 10 people to a movie and then tell them the movie's canceled, except the girl I want to go on a date with. And the only 2 of us show up at the movie. That's not really the way to do it. Number 3 is asked in person. If you're not ready to ask in person, then you're not ready for anything that follows anyway. No one should be asking someone out over a Snapchat message. Like, that's just not the way the world should be. It's also asked well in advance. You have no obligation, if you're asked, to respond to last-minute hangout requests or these lazy, nondescript invitations like, "What are you doing now?" It should actually be something that's planned. It's also asked one at a time. No good can come from trying to cultivate romantic feelings for more than one person at a time. And if you watch shows like The Bachelor and Bachelorette, we see this, where people are not only making out with many people, but they're falling in love with many people. And when you get down to 4 and 5 people left, they're actually saying, "I love you" to all of, it's a very confusing and messy place to actually be in. So one at a time. And lastly, I like this. This is very old fashioned, but I think it could come back. A date is followed up the next day. The rest is up to you, but let nothing stop you from at least thanking the person for their time, no matter how the date went. Now, one of my most asked questions is always about sex. And the best response to this actually comes from a 4-part series Andy Stanley did, and these are all on YouTube, called The New Rules for Love, Sex, and Dating. Andy says this: you will see yourself as the exception to every rule. While it's true that you're exceptional, you're not an exception. He goes on to say this idea of the right person myth, the assumption being that there's a right person for you, and once you've found the right person, everything will be all right. Looking for the right person is a great idea as long as you don't assume that finding the right person ensures that everything will be all right. That goes back to the if you're broken going into a relationship, people won't fix you. He goes on to say probably the biggest question dealing with sex. Now, this is a long quote, bear with me. He says, well, adding a dose of physical involvement into the mix makes a relationship more exciting and enjoyable. It also makes it more complicated. Now, here's the line. You are sexually compatible with far more people than you are relationally compatible. Let me say it again. You are sexually compatible with far more people than you are relationally compatible. My hunch is the root of your previous relational challenges was relational, not sexual. Chances are that you would have addressed the relational challenges more quickly if you hadn't been physically involved. In fact, you would have ended the relationship sooner if you hadn't been sexually involved. Not only is sex not the litmus test for relational compatibility, it actually inhibits and distracts from relational development. Do you get that? Sex inhibits and distracts from relational development. Why? Because sex has the capacity to camouflage an endless list of relational deficiencies and dysfunctions. Romance overpowers objectivity. As Christians, we do life different. We believe that sexual expression should be in marriage. When you begin to use your sexuality to control your destiny in dating, you've moved outside the will of God. He goes on to say, if you allow sexual compatibility and chemistry to sweep you immediately into sexual involvement, you will most likely confuse sexual compatibility for something it isn't, namely a sign. The fact that you can't keep your hands off of her, the fact that you can't wait for him to get his hands on you, is not a sign of anything other than that you are two healthy people who have stumbled across one of the other many healthy people in the world with whom you are sexually compatible. I love that. I think it's absolutely brilliant. He goes on to say that there's probably 8 things that people might say to you, and then we should question these. When you hear yourself saying any of these lines, you owe it to yourself to kind of press pause. The first one is when someone says, I can't live without you. Now, this is actually someone being dependent on you. Number 2, someone says, I can't make it without you. And I would say, if you start to fall, will you both be falling together? What's been great in my life is if I'm kind of falling, my wife's there to help me. And if she's having a bad time, I'm there to help her. But if you're both falling, there's no one to help anyone. Number 3, I'm not sure I want to live without you. Now, that's kind of a self-esteem conversation. So why might your self-esteem be so low? Number 4, I'll never overcome this without you. And I would just say, why not? Why is that person kind of the one thing you need to overcome what you need to overcome? Number 5, with your help, I can be a better person. And be a better person would probably be the answer. Number 6, before you came along, I was lost. And I would say, you're probably still lost. Number 7, I need you. What is missing in your life that you need someone else so desperately? And last, I'm incomplete without you. And I would just say, you're probably still incomplete. Remembering, people don't complete each other. I mean, that was a line from a Renée Zellweger and Tom Cruise movie from decades ago, but it's true. People don't complete one another. Too often I see couples who think if we begin dating, if we get engaged, if we get married, it will fix problems, but it doesn't fix anything. There's a really good video blog by What Is Joe Doing? He talks about Christians and dating. He gives a couple points that we should be moving towards marriage. I like that. He says if you're not aiming for the ring, you are aiming for the bed. Interesting. He talks about intentionality, be vocal, kind of verbalize intentions, which I don't think we do well these days. And last, he says, if your relationship with someone for a while, if you're in it and they still don't know, then we should be done. I like that, right? It's the idea of making advances towards marriage. And this blog is kind of a funny title, How Christians Ruin Dating. And one of the points they said, there's many more you can check out online, but they say by obsessing. If we're dating with the intention of marriage, it makes sense that we wouldn't want to continue pursuing a relationship with someone we see no future with. Yet, we focus on finding out so early on that we end up putting way too much pressure on something that isn't ready to withstand it. Couples end up too serious too fast or breaking things off far too soon. When the goal from the start is marriage, it makes breaking up that much harder. The early stages of getting to know someone are scary and terrifying because we put so much pressure on it. You're opening yourself up. You're being vulnerable to someone who might not feel the same way. So stop the pressure on the first dates. Find out who they are. Go on a few dates, get to know each other, but there should be no pressure. Now, you might have noticed from our talk so far, I'm not a preacher, I'm a teacher. I'm a teacher by gifting and by trade. I taught for 10 years with the Toronto District School Board. But when I build these talks, I read hundreds of books, I talk to thousands of people, and the number one question I get from people on dating is a very simple one. Brett, I'm a Christian, can I date a non-Christian? So here's the answer, very simply, no. And I think we look for all these loopholes and leeways around this, but not only does the Bible say no, but there are incredible practical reasons for this. I would challenge you to go on YouTube and search Tim Keller's A Q&A for Dating a Non-Christian. He says, when the other person says, oh, I don't mind you practicing your religion, I'm not going to try and keep you from your religion. I just don't have your religion. It means that the person looks into your heart and sees the thing that is the most important thing in the world to you, or it should be, and they don't get it. It ultimately means a loss of intimacy. Number 2, it says you will not be able to talk and think God-centeredly with your spouse. I think that's a pretty big thing. There's only so many spheres in our lives, right? Like family and religion and different conversations. But if faith is something that's kind of the cornerstone of your life and your spouse doesn't share it. When I leave to speak, my wife will often pray with me. My kids and I go to church and are involved in church things. Someone often says, God goes or your spouse goes to the outside. If they're coming from a different worldview, that's kind of how it is. And that's really what I see. Remembering, we're not saying that people who don't know Jesus are bad people and we as Christians are good people. We're just different. I hear stories so often that kind of go like this. A couple who decides to get married, both, one a Christian and one a not, and then they're having issues later of where their kids, like where they'll go to school or, how they'll be brought up, or one wants them to be baptized and one doesn't believe in that. The last one says, either you start moving towards the same belief that I have, or it might not work out. It's not an ultimatum, but it needs to be, listen, I'm going to be a Christ follower. You can join me in that, but I'm not going to come down and kind of make some mid-range Christianity where I go to church twice a year. If Jesus is the cornerstone of your life and they don't share it and they don't want to share that, are you okay with that? The idea of a loss of intimacy is a massive one. So again, it's not fair to you and it's not fair to them that you're going to want to change them always. Now, does it work where you date someone who's not a Christian and they become a Christian? Sure. We actually call that flirt and convert. It's kind of a funny, weird name. But the reality is it happens. But for most of the time, what happens is you go from being a fully devoted follower of Christ to being someone who goes to church 6 times a year. And that's kind of a big difference from what you should be. Another blog says 5 Christianese relationship cliches we need to stop using. 1, that God will open the door or close it if it's meant to be. Does God really close bad doors and open up good doors? Sometimes, but often he gives us the wisdom we need to make these choices for ourselves. Sometimes, this article says, I feel bad for God because we blame him for everything. Even with the gift of our free wills, our free minds, and our free spirits. We often walk into bad situations. And then blame God that he didn't close the door. The second one it says is, I'm just waiting on God. This article goes, I believe that more than anything, waiting on God is less about our actions and more about the state of our heart. It's the internal acknowledgement that God knows, he cares, and he has a plan. It means resting in his sovereignty and grace, but it's not an excuse to live a passive life. Waiting on God doesn't mean we push the pause button on life. We learn to take life step by step with an internal anchor holding fast to his promises, but it's important to proactively pursue the things we want in life. That could be a home, it could be work, a job, and it could be relationships, as long as we're always pursuing him first. And the creepiest one I hear in our Christian community is, I just need to focus more on dating Jesus. And I would just say, no to that. We're not dating Jesus. The one thing that bothers me about this phrase is that it assumes that relationships with people and relationship with God cannot coexist. Don't get me wrong, I do believe that there are times in life when God asks us to pull away from the distractions of the world and to hone in on Him, whether you're single or married. But it's important to understand that Jesus can't be your significant other because His role is so much bigger. Now, if God is calling you to pull away and fix your eyes on Him, be obedient, but don't use this phrase to stall commitment or to mask your fears of relationship. So here's a very interesting one we don't talk about much. What are red flags in my relationship? Now, what is a red flag? It's a warning of danger. If you've ever been at a resort, like an all-inclusive resort or at an ocean, and you'll see flags, like green is fine, red means that, there's lots of waves coming in. Maybe we should just use the analogy of lights. Like a red light means stop, a green light means go, and then there'd be kind of a caution. Now, this is something you need to address while you're at the beginning stages of your dating relationship, especially before you're married. Because the things that we see in marriage, now that you're married, these are now harder to deal with. So here's an article that addresses 4 of the main ones. 1, violence towards you of any kind. A warning sign, a red flag would be violence towards you of any kind. Don't ever get involved with anyone who is abusive at all, physically, emotionally, spiritually, because you're asking for trouble. They might say that they're going to change, and you might think that you will change them. But I would just say this, they need to change, be apart during that time, and then if they've changed and shown that they've changed, maybe you could come back together. But that's not something you do with them. Number 2, explosive and unexplained anger while dating. I once was talking to a young woman, and she said her husband would always hit her. And it came from, this was something that they even knew when they were dating, and they never addressed, but she would actually be physically struck. So explosive and unexplained anger while dating is something that's not okay. Number 3, dishonesty. Dishonesty in all things large and small. And lastly is sarcasm and teasing. Now, I love sarcasm and I tease my kids to death. That's not what we're talking about. The problem with these 2 behaviors is that they're often portrayed as just in fun. When you get angry in a response, you're accused of not having a sense of humor. Beware of anyone who engages in mean-spirited sarcasm or whose teasing crosses the border into aggression. These are different things. So remember this, who you date, you're one day going to marry. So it's really important to choose the right person. Now, I am the biggest music fan I've ever met. I had about 7,500 albums, CDs, and downloads until 3 years ago when I subscribed to Apple Music. Now, 37.5 million songs are mine, and I will download them all in the next few years. But can we disagree with this one sentence? Not all music is good. Not all music is bad. I also, and I know we're talking about dating, but I don't even believe in the Christian and secular music paradigms. It doesn't really exist. I think that when we as parents teach our kids to buy into that, we're creating a bunch of students who are not able to discern what is right and wrong. Not everything Christian is good. Not everything quote unquote secular is bad. So again, not all music is good. Not all music is bad, but all music is powerful. If I was just to go through a bunch of lyrics today, Selena Gomez says, the heart wants what the heart wants. And I would say, I don't know if that really would align with a Christian worldview of dating. Beyonce sings, got me hoping you'll save me right now. And I'd say again, the idea of being saved is not okay. Demi Lovato says, got my mind on your body and your body on my mind. And I just think we'll just pass that one by. Tove Lo, if you know Tove. Now, if we're talking body, you got the perfect one, so put it on me. Swear you won't take it long if you... And it goes on to some swearing. Again, probably a different worldview. Lady Gaga says, do what you want with my body. No. Rihanna says, feel me up, feel me up. And Lil Wayne sings blank, 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 blank. Actually, it's actually a real song. Now, all joking aside, I would never date anyone who listens to much of today's popular music. By the way, again, I don't believe in Christian and secular, but so much of popular music today is just brutal. We must separate the message from the noise. The choice today of so many musicians to call women, excuse my language, bitches, sluts, hoes, and whores. This is not okay. It is never okay. Ever. Ladies, you are not something to be used and abused and thrown out. Lady Gaga sings, do what you want with my body. No, that is not okay. We sing to sexual assault and rape and blatant violence against women. Anyone with these ideas and music in their earbuds is headed for problems. And I'd say this, if you're listening to this music, you're not ready to date. And if someone you're looking at dating is listening to this music, they're not someone worth dating. Now, here's what's so interesting to me about music. As soon as I say these things, people get angry. They get angry because I said something against one of their musicians. Today, someone around the world will be killed for their faith. And people still don't seem to realize that people are murdered and martyred for their faith every day around the world. And some of you can't give up a single song, a single band, and you could even say a single video game, television show, or movie. We must deal with the idea of sexting. There's two ways we deal with this. And if you don't know what sexting is, it's when someone sends a sexually explicit, topless, whatever, photo to someone. There's two ways we address this, though. One is called the prophetic mode and one's called the preventative mode. The prophetic mode is more the spiritual conversation. We explain that it's a horrible, flawed, and broken expression of the God-given gift of our sexuality. We also tell them that it's an immoral, that it is immoral, and it's sinful, and it's wrong. Then there's the preventative mode, which is actually my favorite conversation. The preventative mode is our effort to derail sexting by explaining ahead of time the moral, spiritual, relational, ethical, and legal consequences of sexting. In other words, consider now the consequences that could stick with you for a lifetime if you choose in the moment to send or receive a sexually explicit text and or photos. A red flag for this conversation is someone who is asking and someone who is sending as well. Pornography. Now, I have an entire talk on pornography, and on my website, I have so much stuff, but I want to give one quote. But how will young women find these sensual, slow burn experiences in men indoctrinated by pornography? So the psychologist Philip Zimbardo says of young men, they don't know the language of face-to-face contact. Constant arousal, change, novelty, excitement makes them out of sync with slow developing relationships. I love that. Slow developing relationships which build slowly, which is what we need. If you are dealing with an addiction to pornography, if the person you are dating or looking to date is dealing with an addiction to pornography, that's a red flag. And you should right now let them go and deal with that addiction. So we've done all kinds of things. How do you actually know if they're the one? And again, we talked about we don't believe in the one, but how do you know if they're the one that you've actually decided to get married to? Now, you cannot tell by just looking at them. You can't tell by just asking a bunch of questions. You have to actually be with them, ask questions, and see that their answers are lived out in the real world. And by the way, these questions may change a little bit as you get older. If you are divorced or widowed, which I start seeing at my age in relationships, I love this blog in the Good Man Project. 15 honest questions the person you marry should be able to answer. Now, you know what? I'm not going to go through all of these. Let me just give you a couple. One, why do you love me? That's a fascinating question for even couples who've been married like I have for 20 plus years. Will you spend the rest of your life with me? Will you do your best to keep the romance alive? Can you promise to keep the spark alive? Will you support me if I can't support myself? Really great stuff that you can check out. And again, I'll post these articles for you. I think everyone, whether you're dating or single, should read The 5 Love Languages by Gary Chapman. I know this cover is old and it's an older book, but this is a really, really important book. Because here's what it says. You need to love people not how you want to be loved, but how they need to be loved. Now, I learned this one the hard way. Words don't mean much for me. They just don't. A card that has a bunch of stuff in it, I hate cards. So you know what? My wife doesn't buy me cards, and well, she buys some, and I don't buy cards for her at all. So we were a number of years into our marriage, and she said to me once, I really like cards. And I realized there's 5 ways that it says people like to be loved. Words of affirmation, acts of service, which is actually more what I do, receiving gifts, quality time, and physical touch. That doesn't just mean sex. I mean, we're talking everything from a hug to just holding hands or something. So I realized that my wife likes words of affirmation. So I forget if it was our anniversary or Valentine's Day. And so I bought her a card and we're lying in bed that night and she says, "Thanks for the card." And I'm kind of like, "You're welcome." And she said, "Did you read it?" And in my head, I'm kind of going, I'm pretty sure I read it, blah, 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 love, you're the best, whatever. And I said, yeah. And she shows me the card and it says on the cover, "To my husband." Something I'll never live down the rest of my life. The truth is this though, I need to learn how to love my wife, how she needs to be loved. And even for me as a parent, I need to love both my daughter and my son how they need to be loved, not how I want to be loved and I think everyone else is the same. So I'm going to go through a bunch of questions, and I'm going to go through them really quickly. I have one blog on my website with every single question I'm going through here. Here's my goal in this. I want you to realize that there are categories you have to cover, and that dating is bigger than going to a movie, even though we will go to a movie. So we have to look at money. What are your future financial goals? Meaning, there's options, right? You can work and there's different jobs and different jobs pay different amounts of money. How much debt do you have? Are you a saver versus a spender? Do you pay off credit cards at the end of every month? I would never marry anyone who didn't pay off a credit card at the end of every month. That's just me. Now, some people, you think that's fine and that's okay, but I wouldn't. Do you tithe? And I love the idea once of one of our pastors actually talked about, are you a tax collector or an investor in the kingdom? And I really like that. But do you give to the church? The average Christian gives 2% of their income. This is a really big conversation before you get married. If one person wants to give 2 and one wants to give 10, these are big battles. Do you give any offerings? I like the idea of tithes and offerings. Do you give to other good organizations or good things? How about, are you going to have a joint or single account? I don't understand married couples who have 2 accounts, but some people do. What are your parents' spending habits? Who's paying for our dates? Lifestyle expectations? Just realizing that kids are expensive. What are your future financial goals? And even, what is this conversation on money brought up for you? Any questions or thoughts you want to talk about? Again, dating grows. How about faith? Religious background. Are you a Christian? Great. What does that mean to you? Because a Christian can mean many different things to many different people. I know Christians who go to church Christmas and Easter. I know Christians who are in church every week, but they don't really care. Like, what does it actually mean to you? What is your religious background? Will you go to a church together as a couple? Great. Which one? My wife grew up at one church and I grew up at another church, and my wife came to my church for a bit, and then we moved to the church which we attend today called C4 in Ajax. We've been there about 13 years now, but you need to question what church you'll go to. What place does faith play in your life, in your day-to-day life? I think that's the idea of a worldview. Your worldview shapes your values shape your actions. Are you a practicing Christian or a non-practicing Christian? Are you married to your denomination? Will you raise kids in the Christian faith? These are interesting questions. Again, these are not questions you sit down and ask on your 3rd or 4th date, especially some of these things. But if you're dating a non-Christian, these are interesting things. Again, I don't think you should be, but if you're going to, will we raise our kids in a Christian faith? Might be an answer you won't like. What are things that are important to you within your practice of faith and why? Again, what kind of questions might this section have brought up for you? How about dating history? When did you begin dating? What does dating even mean to you? If the average person's sleeping with someone on the 1st or 3rd date, what does it mean to you as a Christian? How many people have you seriously dated? How were your breakups? What is your relationship with your past girlfriend or boyfriend now? How about children? This is a really interesting one. Now, here's the question you're going to have to ask. Do you want children? Now, I'm not saying to someone like, do you want to make babies with me? That's not what we're talking about. But I'm saying, if you're going to look at a future, you need to know if you both want kids. I talked to many people. Here's one story I heard. A guy and a girl, both strong Christians, got married. They talked before, and he never wanted kids and she wanted kids. And suddenly they're 30 years of age, and she said, well, I want kids. And he said, I've never wanted kids. And they got divorced. And I'm like, this should have been solved a decade ago over a coffee, just talking about this conversation. But not only do you both want kids, how many do you want? My wife comes from a family of 3. She wanted 2 kids. I come from a family of 2. I wanted 3 kids. 3 and 2, we can deal with that. My daughter Zoe didn't sleep through the night till she was 2.5 years old, and we ended up having 2 kids, and that's okay. But if somebody wants 1 or 2 children, and you want like a TV show full of like 18 and counting or whatever the TV show is called, like those things don't match, right? You need to actually have something you can talk about and deal with. Number 2, what if you want kids but are unable to? I know a really great Christian couple, and they both got married. They both wanted kids, and then they couldn't have kids. And one was willing to adopt, and one said blood only, and then they split up. I don't understand today, but I have a lot of people I know, friends and family, who can't have kids. Is it plastics? Is it pollution? I don't know. But I just know that there are hurting people who want to have kids, and they can't. And so it's important to say, well, will we adopt? Will we foster kids? What about if you have a child who's disabled? And I have a lot of friends who have kids who struggle with a lot of different things. What kind of home do you want your kids growing up in? How much should the guy be involved? And gentlemen, I say this gracefully, but I dare you to be a different generation of man than most of my generation. The number of absentee fathers who just have not been involved with kids' lives, who've been so busy with work and other things. I just dare you to be a different dad. How much should the guy be involved? As much as the wife, right? It's a partnership in raising kids. Are you prepared to devote your lives to raising strong children? What a great question. Even questioning, what kind of education do we envision for our kids? Meaning, my kids go to public school, and if I was dating someone who wants to homeschool our kids or Christian school, right, those are questions you have to walk through. They might not be deal breakers, right? A deal breaker might be no kids or 10 kids. That's a deal breaker. But if one wants a faith-based school and one wants a private school, or a homeschool, or like those are things we can debate on. Lots of different questions. How about what do you think of rep sports? Now, I coach rep baseball. I'm not against sports, but just, if you play rep hockey or things, you're looking at 5-6 nights a week, and it will affect everything in your life, including church attendance. How might your parenting style, what might it be like? And there's lots of parenting styles we can talk about. How would you discipline your kids? What kind of things and experiences do you want your kids to have? Again, dozens of conversations we can have over a lot of, by the way, this isn't like read all these questions on one date. How about professional goals? What do you want to do for work when you're older? Because this will affect you. I remember once talking to a girl who was really mad because they were moving. And I said, why are you moving? And she said, my husband got a job in England. And she said, I'm really angry. I thought I'd live in Toronto my whole life. And I'm like, you married an international banker. He went through for business to be an international banker. He didn't go through to be a teller or a bank manager somewhere in the city. So now you're moving to an international location and you're upset. Even ladies, if you marry a youth pastor, or if in some denominations the pastor might be a woman and the guy's marrying a youth pastor. But the reality is very simple. If you marry a pastor, you might not live in the same town your whole life. I've been in Ajax my whole life, and I like that. That kind of goes on to number 3. Where will you live for this job, or where do you want to live in life? I'm on a date once. I picked her up, so I walked to the door, and we're walking down. I opened the car door, and as I'm we're chatting, she said some line about, I just can't wait to pack up and move to BC. When I'm older. And I kind of shut the door, and I remember kind of chuckling, and I went around and I closed the door, and I got in and closed the door, and I said, just so you know, this is never going to work between us. And she burst out laughing and said, Brett, we haven't left the driveway. And I said, yeah, but I'm never going to leave where I live. I grew up in a small town called Ajax. Some of you might know Ajax. It's about 45 minutes east of the city of Toronto. When I was in grade 8, I moved from one part of Ajax to another part of Ajax. And when I got married in my mid-20s, I moved far away, all of probably 10 kilometers to the town beside us called Pickering. And then 13 years ago, when my kids were in elementary school, we wanted to be in one house for my kids' entire education. We moved back to Ajax. My kids go to my high school presently, and I love that. Here's the reality. If you don't, I don't care. I married someone who likes the region we live in, but if you marry someone who wants to pack up and move halfway across the country, if you're there, or if they're here and they're not happy, and if you move there, you're not that doesn't work. You need to actually talk about these things. What kind of life and work balance do you want? We're not even talking about passions and interests and skills and education. What kind of family life will your career actually allow you? How about personal health? What do you feel about each other's physical health? How is your own physical health? How do you feel about certain questions? Like, how do you feel about drinking? How do you feel about smoking? I would die if I married a smoker. I'm being quite honest. I have asthma. I would literally die if I married a smoker. But it's fascinating that who you date, you'll one day marry. People don't understand. I'm talking to a girl once, and she's like, she's so mad her husband smokes. And I'm like, I knew him in high school. He smoked the whole time I knew him. Who you date, you will marry. And all those things come through into marriage. Do you eat a healthy diet? Do you exercise? Again, dating grows. How about personal growth? What are your strengths? How are you working on them? Can I challenge you to be a strengths-based person? Work on your strengths. Manage your weaknesses. We're working really hard as a society to be mediocre at everything. What are you good at? Work at that. Get tutors at that. Get educated. Take courses in those things. But what are your weaknesses? Manage them as well. What is the current book you're reading? You should always have a book with you. Students, beyond Shakespeare, whatever you're reading in language class, have a book with you. Be growing in different aspects of life. What was the last conference you went to? What is on your bucket list? And how about one of the bigger conversations, sex? How's this for a question to sit down and talk about? Do we sincerely as a couple want to honor God in this area of our dating relationship? If so, how are we going to do it? Or even the question of what sexual behavior is appropriate for those who are going to practice celibacy, not having sex until marriage. What kind of boundaries? Will there be consequences for boundaries? Will you get tested for STIs? If you're a bit older, STDs. The idea that Christians don't deal with these things, if there's been past sexual partners, there could easily be STDs. Accountability partners for this. Do you have one? Past experiences, negative experiences. Now, of all the sections, this is not an early on question. This is one that you need to have a pretty solid relationship to begin to go through some of these deeper questions. It was a number of years ago. I was at a youth retreat, and on the way home in the bus, one of the questions was, is there anything else you need to tell me about your life? And so this guy turned to his girlfriend and said, is there anything else you haven't told me? And she said, Brett said that's like a 6 months in question. And he said, no, is there anything you need to tell me about your life? And she said after the third or fourth time he pestered her, she said, fine, my uncle sexually molested me for the first 10 years of my life. Now that guy was not expecting that. He was just trying to ask a simple question, and he got a response from the girl that he loved, and they're actually married now, but it rocked him. And I mean, I spent time with him talking and them, and they got counseling together, and it was really a good thing for them, but it could have actually broken up their relationship. It was pretty soon to bring up pretty big things. So there are so many questions you need to go through. They're all listed online. And by the way, you can just Google online questions before you get married, and there are thousands of online articles and blogs. So what if you go through these questions and one of them is a deal breaker? Or what if you go on 10 dates, you're just like, I don't like this person. This is just not what I'm looking for. Make no mistake in the terminology of a breakup. It is a breaking. It is a tearing. And when you've opened your heart to someone and it's not working, it hurts. I remember losing friendships I had for years after I broke up. In one case, I attended a different church for half my life, for 3+ years, and I lost all those people, all that community when we split up. It's not fun or quick or easy, but it's part of the process. And the more you give to someone, the harder it is to leave them. I went through 4 long-term relationships in my life, including one engagement, which was not to my wife. And then those all went through breakups, and they hurt. So what if they want to break up with you? If the other person decides that it's not leading where they hope, here's what you do. You make it as easy as possible for him or her to humbly bow out and to begin looking in other places. What if you want to break up? Simple. Humbly bow out and begin looking in other places. No games, no playing around, not leading someone on. Don't just stay so you're not alone. And here's a couple of breakup rules for you. First, it's in person. No text, voicemail, tweet, Snapchat, we're through. Like none of that conversation. That's not okay. You need to be honest while you're breaking up. I once broke up with a girl. She was beautiful, smart, funny, strong Christian, everything I should have actually wanted in a woman, but it just wasn't there for me, and I don't know why. Now, remember, when you're breaking up, be honest, but you're also not breaking them. Your goal is not to break their spirit and crush their hopes and dreams. So it's finding a balance with that conversation. No drama. And by the way, emotion's okay. Guys, even for you, right? Crying is okay. The reality for many guys is we don't like that, but it's okay to have emotion. Don't trash talk your ex. You might say, when? Ever. Never. It is one of the evilest things I see in the world, where we take someone we once claimed to love, and then a few weeks later, we actually spew hatred and just vitriol out of our mouths. We say horrible things. You know what I wish for my ex-girlfriends? I wish wonderful husbands, great life, great faith, great kids, good community. They're not in my life. We don't hang out together, but I don't wish bad for them. That's just absolute immaturity, what I see, whether it's in the church world or other places today. And lastly, there's never a good time. It will always be close to someone's birthday or Christmas or anniversary or events. And by how you act in the breakup will show maturity for you as well. In this blog, it says here, there's kind of 5 things. Breaking up is not a bad thing. It's okay. Your worth is never tied to other people, which is a very hard one. You will feel like you're a bit worthless when you're suddenly alone, and you can walk through that. You need to learn to truly let go. You will feel normal again. Now, not the next day, not the next week, maybe even not in the next month. And brokenness will lead to growth in your life. And Jeffrey and Alyssa Bethke have a wonderful blog, an online video blog, and they say 4 things here. You learn how important community is, which is just don't isolate yourself. When you've been with someone and you suddenly are broken up and you come back into a group of friends or a church community or someone else, it's going to take a bit of time to kind of break back into that, but that's okay. Don't run away from the pain, right? Don't just kind of bottle it all down and push it down. You can deal with that. Allow yourself to grieve. It's a loss. And it's okay to grieve that kind of friendship that's gone. And just put one day in front of the other. So you've gone through all the questions we've talked about. You have no red flags. You want to be with them. So the question is, what if they are the right person for me? Well, here's the real simple answers. What do you do if they're the right person for you? You've gone through the questions. Your community around you, everyone says everything's good. So all the things we just talked about in the last hour and a bit. So what do? Get engaged. And when you get engaged, I think you should get counseling. Not the 3 sessions a pastor does on sex, money, and I don't even know what the third one was for me. I'm talking go to an actual psychologist, therapist, counselor, and walk through some counseling. I believe in a short engagement. And here's my wedding planning advice. It might sound weird to give you. I'm going to give it to you anyways. When you finally get engaged, everyone's going to give you their advice. And here's what I think you should do. Do whatever you want to do. It's your wedding. Everyone's going to give you advice. Do whatever you want to do. You know what we did? We had a lunch wedding. We had a buffet. We didn't even have plates. We had plates. We didn't have like plates that came out with a caterer. We just went and you got your buffet meal. We had no alcohol. We had no dance. It was lunchtime. Our outdoor tent was actually in the movie The X-Men where the plane takes off. It was literally on that spot. The guys thought it was amazing. Most of the women didn't. My wife came down the aisle to a song by the band Spirit of the West, which gets no radio play. He wrote it for his daughter, I think, or his wife. I loved it. We left to a song by Lord of the Dance. I planned every song for my wedding. I loved it. My wife loved it. I didn't care if anyone else loved it. They did. But plan your own wedding. And then when you get married, now we're not even talking about this, but you're going to continue. You're going to continue in relationship building, community involvement, physical involvement. And I think as not just Christians, all of us in marriage should talk about how do we have and create good sexual intimacy in marriage. It's funny, we say, you shouldn't have sex until you're married, and then you get married and then we never talk about it again. Not okay. We need to be growing together and we need to continue ongoing questions of compatibility. And this is ongoing building, ongoing growth. So where do we go from here? Please remember, don't overcomplicate this. Don't overthink. Don't over-spiritualize, don't over-sexualize. What should we do? I would rather you overdo these things. You should read everything, spend lots of time on YouTube going through videos, prepare, deal with your debt and job and addictions and spiritual life, engage, be around other singles, be around places that you can meet someone. Discuss this. After this video is done, talk about it with the people around you. Maybe you have some questions that you can discuss, things you agree and disagree with, but go through that and utilize community. Be willing to listen to what your friends have to say about who you are dating. You might disagree with that, but you can listen to what they say. If I had to give you my favorite resource, I would just challenge you to go to YouTube and search for Andy Stanley's Love, Sex, and Dating, part 1, 2, 3, and 4. They are 4 of the best sermons I've ever heard on all aspects of love, sex, and dating, so please do that. My website is just brettullman.com. If you go to it, on the top it says Talks. If you click on Talks, it drops down, and all my talks are there. Every talk, except my new one called Navigating Everything, has a little button that says Take Home. If you click on Dating and then Take Home, there is every blog, every article, and dozens of other things that I haven't even mentioned in this talk, all there for you. My social media is there. You can follow me. You might say, why do I want to follow you? I read 320 blogs a week. It doesn't take me very long. They all go into an app called Feedly and I can find them right away. But I read them all and I take the best information out and I reblog it back out to you. And there's a white bar on my website that has all terms like mental health and dating and parenting. Click on the dating tab. It's every dating resource that I've put out in the past 3 years, including every single direct link from this talk and every question we've actually talked about. And my website is a blog as well. So as we end Dating for Life, the questions, here's the one thing I will say. I live before an audience of one. But while I live before the audience of one, and while I'm growing myself spiritually, physically, and emotionally, I will open my eyes to the world of dating. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon.